The moment I saw my seat at my husband's funeral labeled extended family, I realized they had already started erasing me. I stood in the entrance of the funeral home holding my black gloves so tightly my fingers hurt beneath the leather. Outside, cold October rain slid down the church windows in thin silver lines, and the smell of wet leaves drifted in every time the doors opened. Richard Carter had been gone for only 4 days. 4 days since I held his hand in the private hospice room overlooking Lake Michigan. 4 days since the machines fell silent and the nurses lowered their eyes with practiced sympathy. 42 years of marriage reduced to a polished walnut casket surrounded by white roses that Vanessa had chosen because they looked more elegant on camera. I noticed that first. The cameras. Small tripods near the entrance. Professional lighting beside the memorial board. My daughter-in-law moved through the crowd in a cream-colored coat that looked far too bright for a funeral, gently touching people's arms, accepting hugs, whispering carefully rehearsed sadness into expensive tissues. She looked more like the hostess of a charity gala than a grieving widow's daughter-in-law. "Evelyn," she said when she finally noticed me standing near the doorway. Her smile tightened for half a second. "You made it." Made it. As though I were a distant relative invited out of obligation. I nodded once. "Of course." She glanced briefly toward the seating rows inside the chapel. "We tried to keep the front section limited to immediate family only. I hope you understand." I looked past her shoulder. My son Daniel sat in the front pew beside Vanessa, speaking quietly with 2 business partners from Carter Holdings. He did not turn around when I entered. Not immediately. A strange silence settled inside me then. Not shock. Not grief exactly. Something colder. Something clearer. Vanessa handed me a folded funeral program. "Your seat is in the 3rd section near the back. The ushers will help you." I lowered my eyes to the paper in my hand. Beneath the gold embossed cross, someone had written my name in black ink beside the words, "Extended Family Guest." For a moment, all I could hear was the rain tapping softly against the stained glass windows. Richard once spent 6 months rebuilding our first storefront after a winter electrical fire nearly destroyed everything we owned. I stood beside him every single day wearing paint-stained jeans and carrying accounting ledgers under my arm while Daniel slept in a crib near the register. We built Carter Holdings together from a failing hardware store into a company worth more money than I ever cared to calculate out loud. And now, at my own husband's funeral, I had become extended family. Vanessa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There are a lot of executives here today. Investors too. Emotions are running high, so we really need things to stay organized." Organized. That word almost made me smile. I looked at her carefully then. Her diamond earrings. Her perfectly smooth makeup. The tiny flicker of impatience behind her sympathetic expression. She thought I was fragile. Old. Confused. A grieving widow who would quietly disappear into a smaller house somewhere in Florida, while she and Daniel stepped into the Carter legacy. Around us, guests filled the chapel with low murmurs and polished shoes against marble floors. Nobody noticed the widow standing alone near the entrance. Nobody noticed that no one had offered me Richard's armchair seat in the front row. I folded the funeral program once, then twice. "Of course," I said softly. "I wouldn't want to disrupt anything." Vanessa visibly relaxed after that. She touched my shoulder lightly before drifting back toward the front pews where the important people sat. I walked slowly to the back section, passing enormous floral arrangements sent by senators, CEOs, and country club friends who had known Richard for decades. One arrangement carried a ribbon that read, "A great visionary." Another, "Gone too soon." I sat alone beside the aisle and rested my hands in my lap. Across the room, Daniel finally looked at me. Only briefly. Long enough to offer a small distracted nod before returning to his conversation. My own son looked at me the same way people glance toward hotel staff during a formal dinner. Polite, detached, temporary, and sitting there beneath the dim chapel lights, listening to strangers praise the empire Richard built. I realized something they still did not understand. Richard had never trusted appearances. And before he died, he made very certain that neither Vanessa nor Daniel would ever control what truly belonged to him. Or to me. The funeral service ended just after noon, but nobody came to walk beside me as the guests slowly filtered toward the reception hall across the street. I stayed seated for a few extra moments after the organ music faded, watching strangers gather around my husband's casket with solemn expressions and polished condolences that sounded almost identical. Richard would have hated that part. He used to say grief became performative whenever wealthy people stood too close together. Too many expensive watches in one room, he once whispered to me during another executive funeral years ago. I remember trying not to laugh inside the church that day. Now the memory sat inside my chest like something fragile and sharp. I rose carefully and adjusted my coat collar before making my way toward the exit. Near the chapel doors, I overheard Vanessa speaking softly to two women from the country club auxiliary committee. "Daniel is under so much pressure now," she said, shaking her head with practiced sadness. "Richard handled absolutely everything financially. Evelyn never really involved herself in business matters." The women nodded sympathetically. One of them glanced toward me briefly before lowering her voice even further. "Well, at least Daniel can step in and stabilize things quickly." Stabilize things. I continued walking as though I had not heard a single word. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalk slick beneath pale gray skies. A valet opened the passenger door of a black SUV for Vanessa while Daniel stood beside the curb answering business calls without removing his funeral tie. I watched him from a distance for a moment. His posture looked so much like Richard's that sometimes it unsettled me. Same broad shoulders. Same habit of loosening his collar when stressed. But Richard had always noticed me in a room immediately. Even after 40 years. Together, his eyes searched for me first. Daniel barely looked in my direction anymore unless conversation required it. "Mom!" His voice interrupted my thoughts. He finally approached me near the curb with his phone still in his hand. "Are you riding with us to the reception?" "Not with me. With us." Small words reveal everything eventually. "I brought my own car," I answered. He nodded distractedly. "Good. That probably makes things easier." Easier for whom, I wondered. Vanessa stepped closer then, adjusting the sleeve of her cream coat. "The reception venue is packed already. Investors flew in from New York and San Francisco this morning. Richard touched so many lives." I looked at her carefully. She always spoke about money indirectly, as though wealth itself were a living guest seated at the table with us. Every sentence carried calculation beneath the surface. Richard noticed it too, especially during the last year of his illness. The first time he mentioned it was after a Christmas dinner at our lake house in Aspen. Vanessa had spent the entire evening asking detailed questions about company succession plans while pretending to refill wine glasses. Later that night, Richard sat quietly at the edge of our bed staring out at the snow. "Daniel loves her," he said eventually, "but she watches people the way bankers study signatures." At the time, I told him he was overtired from treatments and stress. I wanted peace in the family. I wanted holidays that did not feel divided by suspicion. Looking back now, I realized Richard had already begun preparing for something long before I understood why. The reception hall buzzed with low conversations when I arrived 20 minutes later. White floral arrangements covered nearly every surface, and waiters carried silver trays of champagne between clusters of executives discussing market conditions only hours after my husband's burial. Near the center table, Vanessa laughed softly at something one of the board members whispered to her. Her grief seemed to disappear whenever wealthy people stood nearby. I remained near the edge of the room beside a tall window overlooking the city streets below. Nobody asked where I wanted to sit. Nobody asked whether I had eaten. A distant cousin eventually approached carrying a drink. "You holding up all right, Evelyn?" he asked politely. "As well as can be expected." He nodded awkwardly before lowering his voice. At least Richard left the company in good hands with Daniel. Young families need security nowadays. There it was again. The assumption. The quiet certainty that I had become an afterthought before the flowers at my husband's funeral had even begun to wilt. I stared down into my untouched glass of water and said nothing, because the truth was far too large for that room. Richard had spent the last 18 months restructuring everything. And not one person standing beneath those crystal chandeliers had any idea who actually controlled Carter Holdings now. I stayed at the reception for nearly 2 hours before anyone asked me a question that was not performative. Most people offered the same rehearsed expressions of sympathy, while glancing over my shoulder searching for someone more useful to speak with. The room smelled faintly of lilies, expensive perfume, and roasted coffee from the catering station near the ballroom entrance. Somewhere in the background, soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while conversations about stock projections and leadership transitions floated between crystal chandeliers. My husband had been buried less than 3 hours earlier, and already people were discussing quarterly stability like the man himself had simply stepped out of a board meeting. I stood near the far window watching rainwater slide down the glass when I noticed Vanessa approaching with 2 members of the Carter Holdings executive board beside her. Her posture changed whenever she walked with wealthy men. Straighter shoulders, softer smile, measured laughter. "Evelyn," she said gently, touching my arm like a nurse calming an elderly patient. "I wanted you to meet Gregory and Nathan properly. They worked closely with Richard for years." Gregory offered a polite handshake. Nathan gave me a quick sympathetic nod before returning his attention to Vanessa almost immediately. "Richard always spoke highly of your support," Gregory said. Carefully. Support. Not partnership. Not strategy. Not sacrifice. Just support. I smiled faintly. Richard was very generous with compliments. Vanessa laughed softly beside him. Evelyn was happiest staying behind the scenes. Richard handled the difficult business decisions himself. I turned my eyes toward her slowly. She said it so naturally, so confidently, as though she had personally lived through every sleepless year beside us while we fought to keep the company alive during recessions and lawsuits and market collapses. I remembered balancing payroll checks at our kitchen table in Milwaukee, while Daniel slept upstairs with a fever, and Richard paced beside the refrigerator trying to negotiate with suppliers after midnight. I remembered selling my jewelry during the early years so we could keep 23 employees paid during a brutal winter downturn. Richard used to joke that Carter Holdings had 2 hearts beating beneath one roof. Yet Vanessa spoke about me now like I had spent 4 decades arranging flowers and planning dinner parties. "Daniel has been incredible through all this," she continued. "He is already preparing to step fully into Richard's role." Nathan nodded approvingly. "The markets like continuity." Continuity. Another word for replacement. Daniel finally joined the group then, loosening his tie while checking messages on his phone. "Sorry," he muttered. Tokyo investors kept calling. Vanessa looked at him with admiration polished almost to perfection. "Your father would be proud of how you are handling everything." Daniel gave a tired smile before glancing toward me briefly. "Mom, did someone help you with the estate paperwork schedule?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Not yet." Vanessa immediately stepped in. "Daniel and I were discussing that earlier. We can simplify a lot of things for Evelyn moving forward. The house is far too large for one person anyway." There it was again, quietly inserted beneath sympathy. Removal. Downsizing. Transition. As though my future had already been organized in private conversations I was never meant to hear directly. Gregory shifted awkwardly beside us and excused himself toward the bar. Nathan followed seconds later. People often retreat when family conversations become too revealing. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the same way Richard used to whenever uncomfortable. "Nobody is rushing you, Mom," he said carefully. "We just want to make sure everything is manageable." Manageable. I stared at my son and realized something painful then. He truly believed he was being compassionate. Vanessa had spent years translating control into concern so gradually that he no longer recognized the difference. Across the ballroom, a server carried away untouched dessert plates while guests laughed softly beneath dim amber lighting. I suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could not repair. "I think I am going home," I said quietly. Vanessa's expression brightened for only a fraction of a second before settling back into concern. "Are you sure? We still have family friends arriving from Connecticut later tonight." "I am sure." Daniel kissed my cheek distractedly while glancing toward another incoming phone call. "Get some rest, Mom. We will talk tomorrow." I nodded once and walked toward the ballroom exit alone. Outside, the cold evening air smelled cleaner than the reception hall. Cleaner than the sympathy. Cleaner than the lies carefully wrapped inside concern. My driver opened the car door as rain began falling again in thin steady lines across the city. I slid into the back seat and removed my gloves slowly, staring down at my wedding ring beneath the passing streetlights. Richard knew this was coming. Somewhere during those final months, while everyone else assumed illness had weakened him, he had quietly prepared for war. The house felt unnaturally quiet when I returned that evening. Not peaceful quiet. Hollow quiet. The kind that settles into walls after decades of conversation suddenly disappear. I stepped inside slowly, placing my coat across the back of the foyer chair Richard bought during a trip to Charleston nearly 15 years ago. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence while soft rain tapped against the tall living room windows overlooking the lake. For 42 years, Richard's voice had filled this house. Early morning phone calls from London. Late-night conversations about contracts and employees and expansion plans. Jazz music drifting from his office while he reviewed reports with his reading glasses balanced low on his nose. Now all that remained were still rooms and carefully arranged flowers already beginning to wilt. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes without turning on the lights. The marble countertops reflected pale moonlight from the windows, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing into my chest. Not grief alone. Something more complicated. Betrayal has a very specific kind of silence attached to it. It changes the air around familiar people. I poured myself a glass of water and noticed Richard's leather notebook still sitting near the breakfast table exactly where he left it 3 weeks earlier. My fingers rested against the cover gently. Richard had become obsessive about details during his final year. Legal folders. Financial reviews. Private phone calls behind closed office doors. At first I believed illness had simply made him anxious. But now, replaying everything in my mind, I began noticing patterns I ignored before. The first strange moment happened 6 months ago during a dinner party at the house. Vanessa stood beside the fireplace discussing inheritance tax structures with one of Richard's attorneys, while pretending to ask harmless questions about family trusts. I remembered Richard watching her quietly over the rim of his wine glass without interrupting once. Later that night, after guests left, he stood at our bedroom window looking out toward the lake. "People reveal themselves when they think someone is dying," he said softly. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and changed the subject. Another memory surfaced while I carried my water into the living room. 3 months ago, Daniel canceled lunch with me for the 3rd time in 1 month because Vanessa supposedly needed help organizing charity events. Daniel used to call me every Sunday morning without fail. We had breakfast together twice a month even after he married. But slowly, almost invisibly, Vanessa repositioned herself between every connection like ivy spreading across stone. She never argued directly, never raised her voice. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she replaced closeness with management. "Daniel has so much stress right now. You should not overwhelm yourself with business topics. Let us take care of things for you." Little sentences. Softly spoken. Constantly repeated. Over time, concern became control so gradually that nobody noticed the difference anymore. Including me. I lowered myself onto the sofa and stared across the darkened room toward Richard's office down the hallway. The door remained slightly open. For several minutes, I simply sat there listening to the rain and remembering the final week before his death. Richard could barely walk without assistance by then, but his mind remained painfully sharp. One night around 2 in the morning, I woke to find his side of the bed empty. I discovered him sitting alone inside his office wearing a navy robe over his thin shoulders, while documents covered the desk beneath a brass reading lamp. "Richard," I whispered, startled. "You should be resting." He looked up slowly and gave me that tired half-smile I loved for most of my adult life. "I will rest soon enough." His voice sounded weaker then. Older somehow. I walked beside him and noticed folders marked private and confidential stacked carefully near his elbow. Before I could ask anything, he reached for my hand. "Promise me something, Evelyn." "Anything." He studied my face for several quiet seconds. "When the time comes, do not let guilt make decisions for you." At the time, tears blurred my vision too heavily to understand what he meant. I thought he was speaking about grief. About loneliness. About learning to live without him. Now, sitting alone inside the dark living room while distant thunder rolled over the lake, I finally understood. Richard was not preparing me for mourning. He was preparing me for the family, he believed would reveal itself after he was gone. And deep down, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and sadness, I realized he had been right. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did after difficult nights. For a few seconds, lying beneath the heavy silence of the bedroom, I forgot Richard was gone. My hand moved automatically toward the empty side of the bed before reality settled back over me like cold water. Outside the windows, the lake looked gray beneath low autumn clouds, and somewhere downstairs the heating system hummed softly through the walls. I sat up slowly and wrapped my robe tighter around my shoulders before walking toward the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dying lilies from the funeral arrangements delivered yesterday. I passed Richard's office on the way downstairs and noticed the door was fully closed now. That stopped me immediately. I always left it slightly open after his diagnosis because he hated feeling shut away from the rest of the house. Yet sometime during the night someone had closed it completely. I frowned and walked toward the study. The brass handle felt cold beneath my fingers. Inside, the room looked untouched at first glance. Dark wood shelves, framed photographs from company dinners and charity galas. The leather chair Richard used for nearly 20 years still angled slightly toward the desk. But something was different. Small things. A missing folder near the lamp. One drawer not fully aligned. The subtle scent of Vanessa's perfume lingering faintly in the air beneath Richard's cedar cologne. My stomach tightened slowly. I crossed the room and opened the center desk drawer. Empty. Completely empty. Richard always kept personal financial notes there. Insurance summaries. Legal correspondence. Handwritten observations about board members. He trusted digital systems less during his final years, and preferred keeping sensitive documents nearby where he could physically see them. I opened another drawer. Then another. More gaps. Not random. Selective. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. My phone rang suddenly against the kitchen counter downstairs, making me flinch hard enough to steady myself against the desk. I walked back through the quiet hallway and answered after the third ring. Mom. Daniel sounded exhausted already. How are you holding up this morning? I looked back toward the closed office door before answering. I have had better mornings. He exhaled softly. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we could come by later today. Help organize things a little. There are probably a lot of papers and accounts that need attention now. Papers and accounts. Not memories. Not grief. Not me. That will not be necessary, I said calmly. A small silence followed. Mom, we are only trying to help. I understand. His tone shifted carefully then, the same way executives soften their voices before difficult negotiations. You have been through a lot. I just do not want you overwhelmed by complicated financial matters. I nearly smiled at that. Richard once told me the fastest way to identify manipulation was to listen closely when someone insisted you were incapable before you even asked for assistance. I appreciate your concern, I replied evenly, but I am managing. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Vanessa's voice appeared faintly in the background asking something I could not fully hear. Daniel lowered his voice. There is also the matter of the board meeting Friday. Some transition decisions need to happen quickly. There it was. Faster than I expected. The funeral flowers were still fresh and already they were repositioning power around me like furniture. I am sure the company will survive 1 week, I answered quietly. Daniel sighed with restrained frustration. That is not what I mean. I know exactly what you mean. Silence settled between us then. Heavy. Careful. Measured. Finally he spoke again, softer this time. Vanessa worries about you being alone in that house. I turned slowly toward the lake windows where cold rain drifted sideways across the water. Your wife seems to worry about many things that belong to me. He did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. Mom, please do not start turning this into something ugly. Ugly. Interesting word. As though betrayal only became unacceptable once someone noticed it. I have no interest in ugliness, Daniel, I said softly. I simply need time. After we ended the call, I stood motionless in the kitchen for nearly a minute listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and distant rain against the windows. Then I walked back toward Richard's office and opened the bottom cabinet beneath the bookshelf. Hidden behind old accounting binders sat the small black safe Richard installed himself nearly 10 years earlier without telling anyone except me. My pulse slowed strangely as I entered the code from memory. Inside rested several sealed folders, a silver flash drive, and one cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Evelyn. Only Evelyn. Nothing else. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before carefully lifting it into my hands. Whatever Richard had prepared during those final months had clearly begun long before his funeral, and judging by the missing documents upstairs, someone else had already started searching for it too. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and sat at the long oak table where Richard and I spent most Sunday mornings drinking coffee while the newspaper stained our fingertips with ink. The rain outside had softened into a thin gray mist drifting across the lake, and the silence inside the house felt heavier now that I knew someone had already searched his office. My hands remained steady as I opened the envelope carefully along the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a second smaller key taped to the back page. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately. Strong, precise, controlled. Even near the end, his penmanship never weakened. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I was right to trust my instincts. I paused there for several seconds before continuing. The words seemed to pull his voice directly into the room beside me. Richard explained that during the last year of his illness, he noticed unusual patterns involving company access requests, legal inquiries, and private conversations happening around Daniel and Vanessa. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough to concern him. Vanessa frequently asked questions about ownership structures while pretending curiosity. Daniel unknowingly repeated information from private board discussions that Richard never shared with him directly. Small leaks. Small assumptions. Small acts of entitlement disguised as family concern. My chest tightened slowly as I read further. Richard wrote that he intentionally allowed certain people to underestimate me, because it revealed their true character faster than confrontation ever could. People become careless around women they consider powerless. One line read. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I unfolded the final page. Beneath Richard's signature sat instructions directing me to contact Charles Whitmore immediately, and not discuss any estate matters with Daniel or Vanessa beforehand. Charles Whitmore, Richard's private attorney for nearly 30 years. The man who helped structure every major acquisition Carter Holdings ever completed. My pulse slowed strangely then. Calm replaced confusion piece by piece. Richard had not left me helpless. He had left me prepared. I looked toward the second item inside the envelope. The small brass key. Attached to it was a handwritten note. Private deposit box. Milwaukee First National. My phone rang before I could think further. Vanessa. I watched her name glow across the screen for several seconds before answering. Evelyn, she said warmly. Too warmly. I hope I did not wake you. You did not. Daniel is worried about you. Yesterday was overwhelming for everyone. I said nothing. Silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. She continued quickly. We were hoping to stop by this afternoon to help organize Richard's paperwork before things pile up. There it was again. Paperwork. Access. Control. That will not be necessary, I replied evenly. A brief pause followed. Some of the board members are requesting financial clarity quickly, she explained carefully. Investors get nervous during transitions. Then perhaps the board should learn patience. Her voice softened further. Evelyn, I know these matters can feel complicated after losing someone. Daniel only wants to protect what Richard built. I almost laughed then. Not because it was amusing, because it was astonishing. Vanessa truly believed I had spent 4 decades standing beside one of America's most disciplined businessmen, without understanding how power actually worked. Richard trusted me completely, I said quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear her recalculating. Of course, she answered smoothly. Nobody doubts that. But they did. That was the entire problem. They mistook silence for ignorance, grace for weakness, age for irrelevance. After we ended the call, I walked upstairs to change clothes for the first time since the funeral. In the bedroom closet, Richard's navy cashmere coat still hung exactly where he left them. I brushed my fingertips lightly across one sleeve before selecting a charcoal gray suit from the far end of my wardrobe. Simple. Structured. Sharp enough for business. By noon, my driver pulled onto Lakeshore Drive heading toward downtown Chicago, while low clouds pressed heavily across the skyline. I watched the city pass quietly beyond the window, and remembered another drive nearly 20 years earlier when Carter Holdings nearly collapsed during an acquisition disaster. The board panicked. Investors threatened lawsuits. Reporters waited outside our offices for statements predicting failure. Richard sat beside me in complete silence for almost 40 minutes before finally saying, "If everything falls apart, I trust your judgment more than my own." At the time I thought he was comforting me. Now I understood something different. Richard never viewed me as support. He viewed me as his equal long before anyone else did. The black sedan finally stopped outside Whitmore Legal Advisory Group, beneath a row of polished brass awnings. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, cold wind swept through the city streets, lifting the edge of my coat slightly. Upstairs, somewhere inside that building, waited the truth Richard spent months protecting from his own family. And for the first time since the funeral began, I no longer felt like a widow being erased. I felt like someone about to remember exactly who she was. Charles Whitmore's office occupied the top floor of an old limestone building overlooking the Chicago River. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee, and every surface reflected the kind of quiet wealth that never needed to announce itself loudly. A young receptionist escorted me through a private hallway without asking my name. That alone told me Charles had been expecting me. He stood when I entered his office, his silver hair perfectly combed, his navy suit sharp despite the storm clouds darkening the city outside his windows. For a moment, his expression softened with genuine sadness. "Evelyn." His voice carried none of the artificial sympathy I heard all week. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." I nodded once before sitting across from his desk. Richard left me instructions to come here immediately. Charles folded his hands slowly. Then he trusted his instincts until the very end. That sentence settled heavily between us. He opened a thick black folder already waiting beside him. "Before we discuss anything else, I need to ask you a direct question. Has anyone attempted to access Richard's private documents since his death?" I thought about the disturbed drawers, the missing files, Vanessa's repeated interest in paperwork less than 24 hours after the funeral. "Yes," I answered quietly. Charles exhaled through his nose like a man whose concerns had just been confirmed. "I was afraid of that." He slid several papers across the desk toward me. "Richard began restructuring his estate 18 months ago. Quietly. Legally. Thoroughly." I lowered my eyes to the documents. Ownership charts. Trust agreements. Corporate transfer authorizations. My pulse remained strangely calm as the numbers settled into focus. Carter Holdings majority voting control. Evelyn Carter. Primary real estate trust beneficiary. Evelyn Carter. Executive reserve accounts and private investment holdings. Evelyn Carter. I looked up slowly. Charles removed his glasses. "Richard transferred controlling authority to you last year, after a series of concerns regarding future company stability." Stability. Another carefully chosen word. "You mean Vanessa?" I said softly. Charles remained silent for 2 seconds too long. Then he answered carefully. "Richard believed certain individuals around Daniel viewed the company as inherited lifestyle wealth, rather than responsibility." That sounded exactly like Richard. Precise. Even when disappointed, Charles continued turning pages methodically. "There is more." He handed me another document bearing Richard's signature near the bottom. "In the event of his death, no board restructuring, liquidation, or executive transition may occur without your direct approval for a minimum period of 18 months. I stared at the page quietly. Richard had built a wall around me before he died. Not to trap me, to protect me. "Daniel does not know any of this?" I asked. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa were informed of the final structure. Charles leaned back slightly. Richard insisted complete disclosure would only happen during the formal family and board review meeting next week. A strange sadness moved through me then. Not because of the money. The money stopped surprising me years ago. Wealth changes shape after enough time. It becomes numbers on paper. Buildings. Meetings. Obligations. What hurt was realizing how carefully Richard prepared for betrayal inside his own family, while pretending everything remained normal around the dinner table. Charles opened a second folder. "There is one additional matter you need to understand." He slid a photograph across the desk. Vanessa leaving a private restaurant with Gregory Hale, one of Carter Holdings' senior financial officers. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing scandalous. Just close enough to suggest familiarity beyond ordinary business. Richard hired investigators? I asked quietly. Only after confidential company discussions began appearing in external negotiations. Charles removed another document. Several attempts were made over the past year to pressure Richard into accelerated succession planning. I leaned back slowly against the chair. Suddenly Vanessa's carefully timed concern made perfect sense. The constant conversations about simplifying matters, downsizing, transition, vulnerability. They never saw Richard as dying husband and father first. They saw a shifting empire waiting for redistribution. Charles studied me carefully then. Richard worried grief would make you too trusting after he passed. I almost smiled at that. He always believed I was kinder than I should be. No, Charles. Corrected gently. He believed you loved your family enough to underestimate what greed can become. Silence filled the office while rain streaked against the tall windows overlooking the river below. Somewhere beyond the glass, traffic moved through downtown Chicago, completely unaware that my entire life had just changed shape in less than 1 hour. Finally, Charles closed the folders neatly. The combined holdings under your authority currently exceed $28 million excluding future market appreciation. $28 million. The number itself barely registered emotionally anymore. What mattered was something else entirely. Vanessa and Daniel thought I was standing alone inside an empty house clinging to memories while they prepared to inherit my husband's legacy. They had no idea Richard placed the entire future of Carter Holdings directly into my hands before he died. And sitting there inside Charles Whitmore's office beneath the storm-dark skyline, I realized something important. For the first time since the funeral began, I was no longer reacting to what my family might do next. I was deciding what would happen to them. The board and family review meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Carter Holdings headquarters on the 32nd floor, overlooking downtown Chicago. Richard always hated that conference room because the glass walls made every discussion feel performative. But Vanessa insisted it was the perfect place for transparency and unity. By 11 that morning, I already knew exactly what kind of performance she intended to stage. My phone buzzed twice during breakfast. First from Daniel asking whether I planned to attend in person because the legal review might become exhausting. Then from Vanessa offering to arrange a private driver and reminding me gently that long meetings can feel overwhelming after emotional loss. I read both messages while stirring cream into my coffee and felt something inside me grow strangely still. Not anger anymore. Clarity. They spoke to me like people preparing an elderly relative for assisted living paperwork rather than the woman who spent 42 years building the very company they were preparing to inherit. Outside the dining room windows, sunlight finally broke through the clouds for the first time all week, scattering pale reflections across the lake. I finished breakfast quietly before walking upstairs to dress. The navy suit I selected was one Richard always liked because he said it made me look dangerously composed. At the time I thought he was flirting. Now I understood he admired control more than charm. By 1:30 that afternoon, the elevator doors opened directly into the executive reception floor of Carter Holdings. Conversations softened the moment I stepped inside. Staff members who barely acknowledged me during the funeral now straightened visibly as I crossed the marble lobby. Interesting how quickly posture changes around uncertainty. Vanessa stood near the conference room entrance holding a leather portfolio against her chest. Her expression froze for half a second when she saw me arrive alone. "Evelyn," she said smoothly, "I was not sure you felt up to coming today. I find clarity improves my energy considerably." Her smile flickered but recovered quickly. Behind her, Daniel stood beside Gregory Hale reviewing printed documents spread across the long walnut table. Neither of them noticed me immediately. Through the glass walls I could already see several board members seated with legal counsel and financial analysts preparing reports. The atmosphere carried that familiar corporate tension I had not experienced directly in years. expensive watches, controlled voices, quiet ambition hiding beneath condolences. Vanessa lowered her voice as we walked toward the conference room together. The attorneys will mostly discuss transitional structures today. Nothing you need to worry yourself over. I looked at her calmly. You seem very eager to protect me from information. She laughed softly as though I had made a charming joke. I only want to reduce stress where possible. There it was again. The careful performance of concern. Richard once told me manipulation becomes most dangerous when wrapped in politeness, because nobody notices the knife until after the conversation ends. Daniel finally looked up from the table. When I entered, surprise crossed his face briefly before he approached. Mom, I thought maybe you would prefer staying home. And miss all this? I glanced toward the conference room. That would hardly seem responsible. His expression tightened slightly. For the first time all week, he looked uncertain around me. Good. Charles Whitmore arrived moments later carrying 3 thick black folders beneath one arm. Unlike everyone else in the room, he did not appear nervous. He simply nodded once toward me before taking his seat near the head of the table. Vanessa immediately straightened. Gregory adjusted his tie. Even Daniel's posture changed subtly. Respect reveals itself fastest around real authority. The meeting began with routine condolences and financial summaries projected across massive screens lining the walls. Revenue forecasts, market stabilization strategies, succession preparation. I listened quietly while several executives discussed leadership continuity, as though Richard's absence created a vacancy already waiting to be filled. Vanessa contributed often. Too often. Every sentence positioned Daniel naturally closer to executive control. Every concern she voiced somehow ended with her appearing helpful, practical, composed. Finally, Gregory cleared his throat and folded his hands carefully. The board believes immediate transition planning will reassure investors and prevent unnecessary instability. He glanced toward Daniel. Given family circumstances, we recommend accelerating executive transfer authority where appropriate. Appropriate. Such elegant language for greed. Across the table, Vanessa lowered her eyes modestly while hiding satisfaction poorly behind her expression. Daniel looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Then Charles Whitmore closed the folder in front of him with a calm, deliberate motion that silenced the room almost immediately. Before any recommendations proceed, he said evenly, there appears to be a fundamental misunderstanding regarding ownership authority inside Carter Holdings. Every sound inside the conference room seemed to disappear at once. Vanessa slowly lifted her head. Daniel frowned slightly. Gregory's hand stopped moving across his notes, and sitting there beneath the cold reflection of Chicago's skyline beyond the glass walls, I finally watched my family realize the quiet widow they spent a week underestimating might not be powerless after all. Charles adjusted his glasses slowly while every person at the conference table watched him in complete silence. Even the city noise beyond the glass walls seemed distant suddenly. As legal counsel for Richard Carter and Carter Holdings, he began calmly, I need to clarify that executive transition authority does not currently belong to Daniel Carter or any acting board recommendation. Gregory frowned immediately. Vanessa's posture stiffened beside him. Daniel looked confused more than alarmed at first. Charles opened the black folder in front of him and slid several signed documents across the polished walnut table. Approximately 18 months ago, Richard Carter transferred majority voting control, executive authority protections, and primary trust oversight to Evelyn Carter. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. I watched the meaning settle across their faces one by one like slow-moving weather. Gregory blinked first. Daniel stared at the paperwork without touching it. Vanessa remained perfectly still except for the tightening grip around the silver pen in her hand. Charles continued in the same measured tone. This includes controlling interests across Carter Holdings, private reserve accounts, real estate trusts, and long-term investment structures currently valued in excess of $28 million. $28 million. The number finally landed inside the room like a physical object. One of the board members shifted hard enough for his chair to scrape lightly against the floor. Another quietly removed his glasses. Across from me, Vanessa's carefully composed expression fractured for the first time since Richard's funeral began. Not dramatically, just a tiny break around the eyes. Shock always arrives silently before pride catches up. That cannot be correct, Gregory said finally. His voice sounded tighter now. Charles turned another page calmly. The restructuring was completed legally with full federal documentation and witnessed authorization. He glanced toward me briefly before continuing. Additionally, Richard Carter established an 18-month executive protection clause preventing any leadership transfer, liquidation effort, asset redistribution, or board restructuring without Evelyn Carter's direct approval. Daniel finally looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time in days. Mom, he said slowly, you knew about this? I folded my hands lightly together on the table. Not until recently. Vanessa recovered enough to speak next. Richard never mentioned any of this to either of us. Her voice carried controlled disbelief now, but underneath it I heard something colder. Panic. Charles answered before I could. Richard intentionally limited disclosure. Silence returned again. Heavy this time. Nobody reached for coffee anymore. Nobody checked phones. The entire atmosphere inside the room had changed shape in less than 60 seconds. The widow they treated like an exhausted bystander had suddenly become the single most powerful person in the company. Gregory cleared his throat carefully. Evelyn, naturally the board supports whatever transition feels most appropriate to you. I almost admired how quickly loyalty adapts around money. 3 days ago they seated me behind extended relatives at my husband's funeral. Now executives lean toward me waiting for direction. Vanessa turned slightly toward Daniel. Surely there must be room for collaborative planning moving forward. Collaborative. Another polished word. I remembered her offering to help simplify paperwork, less than 48 hours earlier. Daniel still looked stunned. Hurt too, though perhaps not for the reasons he should have been. Why would Dad keep this from me? He asked quietly. That question stayed in the air for several seconds before I answered. Because your father noticed things before I did. Daniel lowered his eyes. Vanessa opened her mouth as though preparing another careful explanation, but I spoke before she could begin. Richard spent his final year watching people discuss his legacy while he was still alive. He listened more than anyone realized. Nobody interrupted me now. He understood something important, I continued softly. People become very honest when they believe power is already changing hands. Vanessa's expression hardened slightly beneath the surface. Tiny movements reveal more than arguments ever do. I stood slowly from my chair and straightened the sleeve of my navy jacket. Around the table, executives immediately shifted upright without thinking. Respect moves instinctively once fear enters a room. Carter Holdings will remain stable, I said calmly. But there will be no accelerated transitions, no restructuring discussions, and no private negotiations moving forward without my direct involvement. Gregory nodded immediately. 2 other board members followed seconds later. Vanessa remained silent. Daniel looked emotionally exhausted. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the funeral program labeled Extended Family Guest resting inside my drawer at home. I remembered the quiet conversations about downsizing my life before Richard had even been buried for 24 hours. I remembered Vanessa standing in cream-colored designer fabric pretending grief while planning succession beside the casket. Compassion has limits once dignity is gone. Charles closed the final folder neatly while the room remained silent around us. I picked up my handbag and looked once toward the skyline beyond the glass walls where late afternoon sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds over Chicago. For 42 years, I said quietly, people assumed I stood behind my husband. I turned toward the door then. They never realized I was the one holding everything together.